Ramadhav Garu, congratulations first of all on this new book. You seem to be writing books faster than your followers can read them. But this is the second book that I have read in this last 6 months or so. Just to inform the audience, I had a wonderful conversation with Ramadhav Garu when his earlier book, which I think is a kind of a, these two books were together, I think conceptualized together. The first book was Because India Comes First. And I had a wonderful conversation with Ram Madhav on our Hyderabad Literary Festival channel. So this is my second book that I have had the pleasure of reading. But Ramadhav Garu, when politicians start writing books, it sends a particular signal. And the signal is either you are out of power or out of favor. So, in your case, which is true?
We don't need any journalists when Vijay Kumar ji is here to put provocative questions. Before I respond, let me take this opportunity at the very outset to thank Sri Ramchandra Rao ji for putting this event together. And for some of those who have attended the previous event also, I want to clarify that I don't have any patent right over this organization. It is a coincidence that same organization has organized both the events. But I request Ramchandra Rao ji to continue to do other events also. Otherwise, people may mistake that this is my organization. I am really grateful to Justice Raghuram Garu for his kind words earlier in this event. He is a very renowned jurist, a very senior member of the judicial fraternity in India. For him to go through the book and share his ideas is certainly a great blessing for me. I profusely thank him for that. Now, firstly, if only those who are jobless have to write books in politics, there are many who can do that, who do that. This book I have started writing when I was in the thick of my political activity, sometime in 2018. It's true, I mentioned it in my foreword also, that because of the pressing political commitments and all, especially during the run-up to the parliament election, obviously I could not complete it. So the Amazon, their Indian publishing Westland, was kind enough to, as a stopgap or as a filler, they were kind enough to publish an anthology of my articles because this book was getting delayed. So they said, okay, let we bring out something else initially, then whenever you complete it, give it to me. You are right in one sense that I got some leisure time when I was dropped from the BJP's national executive. That also I mentioned in the foreword. So in a way, it came as a kind of a blessing in disguise, although I don't want such blessings. But it helped me complete this book. So I have been able to complete it in that period. But there is a reason behind coming out this book. Before you ask me for that, let me say that from my side itself. That generally, we the Hinduttvavadis, the right-wingers so-called, we are all called as fools by our, adversaries. But the problem is all wise men are so. We have a solid philosophical basis for our vision, for our activity. That needed to be presented to the world at a time when there are even movements to dismantle Hindutva. It's another matter that those movements, they fell flat, and there cannot be a better timing for this kind of a book to come out. In that sense, yes, I have made use of some leisure that I got after I am freed from the political activity. That helped me complete this book.
Yeah, you kind of preempted my next question because I thought at a time when winning elections became the only ideology, or since you don't like the word ideology, philosophy, what motivated you to give a kind of a theoretical aura to this entire exercise?
There are two reasons. Firstly, in the realm of ideas, in the last century, if there was any one original Indian socio-political idea that was offered to the entire world, it was Gandhiji's Ahimsa and Satyagraha, non-violence and truthful resistance. That was the only original idea that had emanated from India, based on India's wisdom, India's ancient knowledge and all that. Deen Dayal ji happened to be another person who had propounded an equally profound socio-political idea in the form of integral humanism sometime in 1960s. He started it in 1964 and organized it into 4 lectures in early 1965. But what happened was, unlike Gandhi, Deen Dayal ji did not get enough time to develop his philosophy. He met with an untimely death in early 1968. So he could not really develop it into a comprehensive philosophy or comprehensive idea. That is one reason I thought that the second original contribution of India, based on its own ancient wisdom and millennia-old wisdom, should be presented to the world in a coherent way. That's one reason. Second reason, this is my honest feeling, that a time has come in the life of our nation to stand up and give its bit to world civilization today. Such opportunities come to every nation from time to time. Those moments come in the life of, in the history of mankind, when there is a transformative, transformation taking place, a major transformation taking place. One such moment was after the Second World War. We were not ready at that time because we were a newly independent nation. So we could not offer our wisdom to the world because we were ourselves just out of the clutches of the foreign rule. Although this wisdom that today we are talking about has been there for millennia in our country. But today another opportunity is at hand. The post-COVID world is going to be markedly different from what we have experienced in all these years. The world order that we have lived in the last 60, 70 years was a product of the thinking of post-Second World War. After the Second World War, the Western and European ideas have gained credibility in the world. They became the mainstream thinking of the world. But in the 21st century, we reached a point where you need to look for a very different and a better alternative view, alternative world view. And here is an opportunity for India to stand up and offer it to the world. In that, Deen Dayal's integral humanism will be of great help to all of us. Now, having said it, are we ready for that today? I personally feel no. We are still struggling. For that to happen, India has to first of all invent itself. Its own persona should come out. I have discussed it at length. And I believe that next 10 years are going to be crucial for India to reinvent itself in its own mold. And for the world, because these 10 years are going to define the future of the coming century. And this, I am not saying, Joe Biden said it in his speech at the United Nations. Xi Jinping said it in his speech at the United Nations. Everybody is talking about next 10 years. So you have a window of 10 years. If you can reinvent in these 10 years, you are in a position to give better direction to the world. I feel that there cannot be no better opportunity because there is a government in this country which is, broadly speaking, which is sympathetic to these ideas. So if only all of us together can help, propel that government also to work in that direction, I'm sure we have an opportunity at hand. That's the reason why I tried to highlight these aspects at this juncture.
Very early in the book, you make an interesting distinction between idea and ideology. And you left it as a very cryptic comment, but could you elaborate that?
Oh, yeah, sure. In India, we never believed in the whole concept of ideology. Although many people call it Hindutva ideology, RSS ideology, etc. Ideologies are closed framework of ideas, closed set of ideas. You can check the Webster's dictionary about the definition of ideology. It is a set of ideas propounded by somebody as a panacea to the given situation. But when did we produce any ideologies in this country? We only produced ideas. India has never produced any ideologue like Karl Marx or John Stuart Mill. We only produced philosophers. We produced an Adi Shankara. We produced an Aravindo. We produced a Vivekananda. We produced a Mahatma Gandhi. We produced many others, including Ambedkar. They are all philosophers. They have given ideas. They have not created any ideologies like Marxism or any other isms. So, the Indian way is to give ideas. It is for you to take. It is for you to develop your own, your own institutions, your own structures based on those ideas. That has been the way of India. Whereas in the West, they believed in isms and ideologies. The very reason why I use the word Hindutva, one is, of course, Hindutva sells. But that's not the intention. I could not have called it Hinduism. Because we don't consider Hindu view or Hindu thinking as any ism. Isms are driven by a book. Isms are propounded by certain philosophers, certain prophets. It's not even an ism. It's a very open-ended thing. In any Hindu discourse, it used to end neti neti, neither this nor that. Maybe what you are saying is also true. Maybe what I am saying is also true. Maybe you are untrue. I am also untrue. Truth is something else. We are such an open society, such a liberal, inclusive thinking. So we never produced ideologues in this country. We produced ideas. Ideologues produce certain theses that have a shelf life. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels produced their first ideology in 1857 in the form of Das Kapital. It took 50 years for the world, some parts of the world, to accept it. In 1917, Soviet Russia accepted communism in one form, Marx ideas in one form. After another 50 years, China accepted in another form. But Gandhiji's idea of Satya and Ahimsa immediately picked up by many countries. Ideas travel faster than ideologies. In any case, Hindu thinking is never about finality. This is the final solution, is not in Indian way. We are always philosophers, not ideologues. That's the reason why I generally desist from using the word ideology. As far as RSS is concerned, we don't have any ideology. We have great philosophical idea, thinking and world view, which we are proud of, which we call as Hindutva. Somebody can call it in any different name.
But if we look at this dyad, idea and ideology, how do we apply this to Hinduism and Hindutva? Do they correspond? I mean, is one of them an idea and another is an ideology, or, I mean?
In fact, that is precisely the whole purpose behind using that phrase, and also the whole content of the book. Hindutva Sanatana, Indic, India, these are all one and the same. This distinction which is sought to be created by certain, mostly our adversaries, that Hindutva is different from Hinduism. For want of any other word, I am using that word Hinduism for easy understanding of all of us, is a very fictitious interpretation. Hindutva, Hinduism, Sanatana, Indic, India, Bharat, these are all just synonyms. There is no difference in these words or in the content, in the essence, what we believe in. But there is an effort to create a distinction between these two. Now, Hindutva is different from Hinduism. No, it is not. That's the whole purpose of writing this book. Whatever Hindutva stands for, why the word Hindutva? In fact, I can make a confession here, that Hindutva was originally not the terminology used by any RSS leaders. Originally, I'm talking about the founder, the second chief. That was not the terminology used. They always used the word Dharma, Sanatana, Vedic, Bharatiya, Hindu. Hindutva was coined by Savarkar. Savarkar tried to create a framework. As I said, Hindutva is beyond any frameworks, but he tried to do it. He tried to give a definition. Asindu Sindhu Paryanta Yasya Bharata Bhumika Pitrubhu Punyabhuschaiva Savai Hinduriti Spruta. Those who consider it as Pitrubhumi, fatherland. First of all, there is no fatherland concept in our tradition. And Punya Bhumi, you have to, of course, consider it as a sacred land. So, he tried to give a framework to it. Somehow it has been attributed to us. We don't mind. But what one describes as Hindutva is no different from the core ideas or core ideals of Hinduism or Sanatana or Bharatiya or Indic. So, that distinction is just baseless.
I know, coming to that very pamphlet that you refer to, 1923, Savarkar's pamphlet. Interestingly, you argue in this book that, and you quote from the Rig Veda, that India is always seen as the divine mother, and Bharat Mata has its origins in that concept. But Savarkar himself always used the word fatherland, right? So my question is, at least among the Sangh Parivar, is there a common understanding of Hindutva?
No, yes, there is a common understanding of Hindutva, and that is that Savarkar has a right to call it Pitrubhumi, I have a right to call it as Matrubhumi. That is the common understanding. That is Hindutva, please remember. It's not a straight jocketing. It's not about insisting that you should say only this, you should only use this language. We today take pride in the contributions of many people. We talk about, I profusely quoted Gandhiji in this. I referred to Sardar Patel in this. Some of our Congress friends are so petrified. They said, you are appropriating our leaders. So I reassured them, don't worry, we are not going to appropriate any of your contemporary leaders. Keep that liability with yourself. Whom we are appropriating are not Congress leaders, they are national leaders. So those great people, we had certain differences with even Gandhi's thinking on certain issues. For example, Gandhi's approach at one point had led to greater, Muslim League gaining greater strength. He approached it from how a Sanatani Hindu approaches to it. But you are dealing with a different kind of movement. Muslim League is a totally different, was a different animal. So we had differences on that. But yet, we respect Gandhi for his greatest contribution to not only India, but to the entire mankind. That is the spirit. So Savarkar using fatherland in a context was his idea. Again I said, Hindutva as an ideology. Probably Savarkar had it in mind that Hindutva needed to be defined in a very specific format. Fair enough. People accept it, take it. Such efforts happened in the past. In 8th century, 9th century BC, there was Charvak. He defined it differently. He gave an almost atheistic interpretation of Hinduism. But we called Charvak a Maharshi. That is the beauty. So this is not, there is some institutional structure called Sangh Parivar. And if there is any such thing, in any case, Savarkar never joined RSS or never supported RSS. In fact, he came to one of the RSS programs and once declared that you are born as an RSS Swayamsevak, you grow up as an RSS Swayamsevak, you die as an RSS Swayamsevak, you do nothing. This was his understanding of RSS. Fair enough. We said, all right. Today I was listening to a speech by a very staunch Hindu. He was critical of Hindutva. He said, you are all duffers. I said, yes, many great men are. What can you do? So, that is the beauty of Hindu thought. You will have diversity at the surface level. But at the subterranean level, your ideas are same. Look at Savarkar's vast literature. How beautifully he acted as a reformer of Hinduism. A huge contribution that he has made. So leaders need to be understood from the context in which they were talking about, they were articulating their ideas. That is also very important. In fact, in that I would say, Gandhiji was that way a very intellectually honest leader. Gandhiji at one point says, if you find my ideas in 1915 to be different from my ideas in 1945, take the latest. I don't defend what I said in 1915. The reason is, during the course of my journey, probably I have learnt more, I have matured my ideas. So, leaders articulate many ideas at different points in time. That is the freedom that we have in our society. We are not a Marxist society, communist society.
Yeah, but since you mentioned both Savarkar and Deen Dayal Upadhyay, another, again, you might just call it, the freedom of diversity. But, on the one hand, you quote Deen Dayal Upadhyay to say that the source of national feeling is not staying in the same land, in the same piece of land. So nationalist feeling has nothing to do with geography. If that were so, how do you explain Savarkar's insistence that Hindu is only one whose fatherland and holy land is India?
Respect for motherland, respect for territory, for that matter, whether it is you call it motherland or fatherland, respect for territory as one of the ingredients for any nation to survive is very well accepted across nations, including Hindu philosophy. Even in our own, our own ancient philosophy, we start our own identity by describing the land, the territory. Jambu Dvipe, Bharatvarshe, Bharatakande, is disha mein, us disha mein. From there you start. Land territory is never considered as unimportant for a nation's existence or nation's progress. But land territory alone does not constitute a nation. This whole idea that territory and clan, territory and language can constitute a nation is a very European idea of the 18th and 19th centuries, which they described as nation state. Whereas in our concept, of course, territory where you live is important, but nation's ingredients are much more than just mere territory. So that's why the emphasis of Savarkar on Pitrubhumi, that is fatherland or territory essentially, talking about the land, but also Punyabhumi. Punya Bhumi means this is my sacred territory. What is that sacredness he was talking about? That sacredness was about its great history, its great ancestors. It comes from that. Sacredness comes from that. So he was giving a very vast definition to it. Again I say that one expression, Pitru Bhumi, it need not be accepted by everybody, because Pitru Bhumi as a concept used to be there in certain Western countries, but broadly all over the world. In fact, I gave a lot of examples in this, including Russia today. The expression is motherland, mother country, country as a mother. But greater emphasis is there is a sacredness to it. That sacredness comes because you have a great history. Now, suppose, God forbid, you lose territory. What will happen? Even then, that spirit of nation remains. That is what, when we say, land territory is not the sole criterion for the formation of any nation. We had that experience in 1947. We lost territories. Or even before that, partition happened. Some sections of our country became another country today. So, does that sacredness go away because we accepted partition? We believe that no. That sacredness remains. Now, if Pakistan celebrates 5,000 years of Panini, 5,000 years ago there was no Pakistan. But they celebrated it, 5,000 years of Panini. You go to China, there is a place called Loyang. In Loyang, they had the China's first Buddhist temple built in 1st century AD. First Buddhist temple. There is a plaque there. You know what that plaque reads? The two Buddhist monks from Afghanistan came on the invitation of the king of Loyang and established the first Buddhist temple there. Was there Afghanistan in 1st century? That was part of India. What you call as Bharatvarsha. They went from Kandahar, which was Gandhar. So that sacredness will remain. Okay, today we are two countries. My point is, when was India one country before 1947? When we became independent, we had 560 kingdoms in this country. Throughout India's history, it was never under one king, one ruler. Only after independence, through constitution, we created one state, which is good, it's needed. But merely because you don't have a state or you don't have a territory, that sacredness does not go away. That should not be misunderstood, that now I want to take over Pakistan. No. Let them, let it be there as long as they want. Or who knows what happens in history. But that sacredness should not be missed. That sacredness should be always remembered. It may take time. It may take time when at some point maybe everybody, all of us again decide that we all belong to that sacred culture, sacred society. We have to become one. That is Akhand Bharat. Akhand Bharat is not about erasing borders. It's about erasing divisions created in our hearts. Please remember, 1947 was not just about partition of territory, it was about partition of hearts. Before we erase partition of territory, we should erase partition of hearts.
Ram Madhav ji, this logic that Hindu also includes non-Hindus, and Hindu is not linked to religion or a particular faith. This sounds like using the word he and defending it by saying that it also includes she. So why not a less or a word that is not linked to a particular faith? Like, for example, you said Bharatiyata. And since Bharatiyata has not linked to a particular religion, right, or a particular faith, why not prefer Bharatiyata rather than Hindutva.
No issue. We absolutely don't have any issue with that. In fact, the entire literature of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya only talks about Bharat, Bharatiya, only these words. In fact, incidentally, Deen Dayal does not use the word Hindutva. He talks about Hinduism occasionally, but he always uses the word Bharat, Bharatiyata. But not because of the reason that you are citing. No, because Hindu is misunderstood, so use Bharatiyata. Not because of that. Bharat, Bharatiyata also denotes the same thing as Hindu. Now, my simple point is, throughout their movement, Congress leaders have used not even Bharatiyata, the word India. Could they prevent partition? Did they use word Hindu? In fact, even in spite of their saying that we are, all religions, we are for India, all that, constantly Muslim League accused them of being a Hindu party. You must read that entire discourse where they say that, you are pretending to be, the party of all Indians. No, you are only leaders of Hindus. That was the logic on which Muslim League had insisted and got an invitation for the first round table conference. Initially there was no invitation. Then Jinnah argued that no, Congress does not represent Muslims of this country. Did Congress use the word Hindu? No. The problem is not with word Hindu or Bharatiya. Even if you say Bharatiya, the problem is with your content. When you say that we are all one people, our oneness is not because of any political institutions, but because of our thousands of years of history. That needs to be accepted. Then only in this diverse country we can create that unity. For that purpose we are using the word Hindu. But Hindu, for the sake of denoting this great culture and civilization, which people easily understand. Look, our problem is very interesting in our country. You talk about any Hindu scripture, 80-85% of the people very easily understand it. But you don't want to talk about it, this 80-85, this Hindu scriptures which easily 80% understand, because remaining 10% may not agree. You are more concerned about that 10%, but in the process you want to ignore 80%. Who will teach these values to the 80% Hindus who believe that they are Hindus? Now, the remaining 10%, they are also part of the same pantheon, same culture, same civilization. It's at some point, it's our duty to tell them that, okay, you can practice your religion. There is no bar in India for practicing any religion. For that matter, India is one country where every other day a new religion pops up. Satya Saiites, Ramakrishnites, अभी तो कल की भगवान का हो जाता है, एक बहुत हो जाता है. Where is one Hindu religion in this country? The multiplicity of religions. And Dr. Radhakrishnan called it commonwealth of religions. In that commonwealth, why is there no scope for another couple of religions? There is always scope. गाड़ी कोई उसमें rush हो जाएगा नहीं. But are you ready to convey this to others? Or because some people are uncomfortable, you better think that, okay, give it up, don't talk about it. We believe that no. If you want to use other words, you use them, there is no problem. Bharatiya Janata Sangh has tried to use the word Indianization. They felt that in every Indian, that spirit of India should be rekindled. They called it Indianization. Immediately what it was granted. Indianization is a camouflage. What you want to do is Hinduization. So the problem is not with the words alone. It's about the content also. So as far as we are concerned, we use Bharatiya, Hindu, Indian, Indic as synonyms. We don't have any issue. But those who have objection to it have objection not just to the word but to the content. There you have to think whether their objection is right or not.
A major part of the book is devoted to describing what is wrong with the West, its theories, its ideologies, its practices, etc. My question is, you constantly invoke the West as a way of defining the self, right? So my question is, why so much preoccupation with the West and defining oneself as the other of the West?
No, not really.
Let me just give you just one simple example. The subtitle of your book says, "A quest for a non-Western ideology, non-Western worldview." Now, why non-Western worldview and why not a quest for Indian worldview?
Yeah. The reason is, you and me in the last 70 years are so much immersed in European ideas that you now believe that anything else need to be inferior. There cannot be any other idea except those ideas which have emanated in Europe in the last century. So then, even Deendayal Upadhyaya, he said, okay, here is something which is not anti-Western. I did not use the word anti-West, please remember. I could have used it. I said, here is a non-Western worldview. Why? Because today the whole world, whole discourse, whole socio-political discourse in the world is centered around ideas that have European origin. Please go to the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly in 1946-1949. You know, when the draft constitution was presented towards the end of 1948, Ambedkar gives a speech. In that speech, Ambedkar says something very interesting. He says, you know, the Constituent Assembly, the drafting committee has 10 members. The committee is grappled with a very difficult situation. What is the difficult situation? In front of us is 1935 Government of India Act. In front of us is an American Constitution, an Australian Constitution, a Canadian Constitution, an Irish Constitution, and conventions of UK. It was such a daunting challenge that how to create Indian Constitution by taking wisdom from all of them. I'm not criticizing. Fair enough. We have produced a constitution based on the wisdom of all the great constitutions of the world, which Ambedkar himself admits in that. And it has worked very well for India for the last 70 years. In fact, I always say that probably we have implemented those European ideas better than the Europeans themselves. Our democracy is better than many democracies of Europe. But at that time, in fact, Ambedkar refers to it also. He says, in fact, Andhra Kahi Tanguturu Prakasham Pantulu. T. Prakasham stands up and raises this question, what are we doing? Where has Gandhi disappeared? Why is there no discussion about Indian, ideas? Why are we not talking about Indian jurisprudence? Indian lawmaking? Why is there no scope for it? He asks. So much so that in the entire constitution, we don't call India a nation. The preamble describes India as we, the people of India. We are the people. Then in Article 1, we describe India as union of states. It's not me who is raising this question, but in the Constituent Assembly, many members ask Ambedkar, why are you simply imitating American Constitution by calling it, we the people of India, because American Constitution begins with the statement, we the people of the United States of America. So, why not call it, we the nation of India? Why not call India as a nation? Ambedkar says, it's all good to call India a nation, but do we have that national consciousness in us? We are divided into castes, we are divided on religious lines, this line, that line. So you cannot call India a nation, you have to build a nation here. Now, to the extent that we were not ready to call ourselves a nation. Because we looked at the whole political, social framework from a very European prism. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Gandhi, Deen Dayal, both insisted that democracy is the best form available, best available form, not the best form. But both say that democracy with Indian characteristics चाहिए. Gandhi ji ने कहा कि मेरे लिए democracy राम राज्य है. And he defines it. My definition of democracy should be that the weakest shall have the same power as the strongest. Do we have it in our democracy today? Deen Dayal ji says, democracy should not mean majoritarian rule. It has to be that those who are non-majorities, or you call it minorities, not in religious sense, minorities should also have a proper say in the running of the polity, the political systems. Does our democracy allow that? Yet, it's a good, best available form. Now, the whole problem is, we decided that there cannot be any better form. Look at constitutions in the rest of the world. Together with us, Israel became independent. They declared themselves a Jewish nation. Look at their constitution. Right or wrong, can be a debate. I am not getting into that. So there can be other models. I am saying, look at it from a non-European view, non-Western view. Because we are so much entangled with it, so much immersed in it. That is the only reason. It's not anti-West, nor is it you and me discourse. In fact, many ideas I appreciated, but I gave an Indian, interpretation to those ideas, including feminism. I said India has its own, feminist ideas, in a different context. Our contexts are different. So it's not as though we needed an enemy to present our case. It's our case, but since we need to understand it from today's European context, I gave so many European examples.
Yeah, since you mentioned that, another preoccupation I found in the entire book is the preoccupation with the past. You just mentioned. Anything you say, oh, it's all there in the past. So you always locate perfection in the past. Is this a kind of a reflex response to communism which locates perfection in the future?
As Justice Sir just mentioned, this book is a heavy reading book. You need to read carefully. I made a number of statements which actually criticize some of the aspects of our past. I say that the Jati Vyavastha in this country has outlived its utility. The Varna of ancient times was different from the Jati which has been in existence for almost 2000 years now. I did not agree with that. Nor did I agree with many things that have happened in the medieval period in our country, including pushing our women into kitchens, where I did not fully endorse the economic views based on traditional Indian thinking, that of Gandhiji as well as of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya. And in the last chapter, I also said that Deen Dayalji said that the English educated people in this country are uprooted people. They are no longer rooted in India. I disputed even that. So don't blame me for something I have not done. I have only taken those things which are relevant for the discourse today. Where they are not relevant, I contested them. No, those things cannot be accepted today. In fact, that is again the greatness of Hinduism. Puranamityeva na sadhu sarvam, na chapi sarvam navamitya vadyam, santah parikshan yatrad bhajante, mudha paraprachenaya buddhihi. Meaning, just because it is old, it's not going to be glorious. Puranamityeva na sadhu sarvam, na chapi sarvam navamitya vadyam. Whatever is new is not necessarily very good. Santa, wise men, test it and take it. Fools imitate. So that is the Indian wisdom. I definitely argued on those lines only. I never said whatever is in the past is great.
Coming to Deen Dayalji's philosophy, which is based on the 4 lectures, to me it was very clear, what you are opposing. But what you are proposing is not really as concrete. For instance, he says that the core idea of a country is dharma. Now, that itself is a very, very difficult concept. Similarly, you talk about chiti, right? Which is, so these are extremely not only complex, but perplexing concepts, and then those are given as the core ideas.
Yes.
So in that sense, do you think that, while it becomes very easy for one to oppose something, right, an alternative model becomes that much more difficult because what is proposed as the alternative is completely kind of vague.
Yes. Again, we are again obsessed with that whole European thinking that you have to give a framework. Based on that, you give us a model. Based on that, we accept your philosophy. I am saying we are not about giving models in the first place. We are only about giving ideas. Based on that, you have to reform the existing institutions. It's a gradual process. It's not that you simply remove it and replace it with something else. Did we not attempt it with caste? Did Ambedkar not write about annihilation of caste? Could he annihilate it? Could anybody annihilate it? On the contrary, caste identities have got further fortified in the last 50 to 70 years. Only reason being politics in this country. Only, I am ready to say that. So, it's not about just giving an alternative framework per se, but an alternative, very Indian thought process. For that, I tell you one thing. You are a very learned person. Again, I refer to that Das Kapital. Das Kapital was authored in 1856-57. And the whole prediction was that industrialized countries would immediately go for it. The model that Marx had in mind or Engels had in mind. No industrialized country even remotely touched it with a barge pole. Finally, it was adopted by a highly agrarian country called Russia. But that too, after 70 years, after so much of writing, so much of articulation by Marx, Marx continued to talk about it, continued to write about it. When it comes to integral humanism, are we ready, first of all, fundamentally, to say that yes, probably we can develop it and come up with an Indian alternative model? See, all models come up at some point because some people stand up and articulate them, isn't it? Where have all these present ideas come from? From certain European scholars. They were great people. They unshackled themselves from the Abrahamic and Semitic thinking and started thinking afresh. Can we also think like that? Can we now work on these things and develop models? Then it is possible. For example, I tell you one simple thing, not to extend it. Now, one of the greatest emphasis of Deen Dayalji, Gandhiji and entire Indian system has been that the state's role should shrink. That is the Indian model. Whereas the European model is state is everything. Government is everything. I can tell you about my own childhood. Role of state in my life was 5% when elections come. We used to think about it. Rest of the time, in my part of the country, even bridges and canals used to be built by zamindars. Not even state, no DC, no collector, nobody has any role. India used to be that kind of society where kings used to fight. Sometimes foreign aggressors will come, they will invade you, so you have to fight. If there is no foreign aggressor is coming, we are very fond of fighting, so we fight with each other. पड़ोसी के राजा से झगड़ा करेंगे, करते रहे हैं, but did people fight in this country? Public life, civic life always went on because center of public and civic life was never the state. But look at today, right from your ration to your job to everything in your life is controlled by government. Good or bad? My belief is this has to change. Government has to shrink. Society has to take up the responsibility. We can do that. If you allow the society to do that, you don't allow. I was in one village in Tripura. I went to one place. I found lot of cows, cattle tied in bathrooms, toilets. Asked that village head, यार टॉयलेट्स तो सरकार ने, मोदी जी ने वो स्वच्छ भारत अभियान लिया तो टॉयलेट्स बनाया, तुमने पशु को वहां बांध दिया. तो that fellow said, sir, in our village we were badly in need of a cow shed, but government was not granting money for cow shed. तो हम क्या करें, हमने ये शेड में बांध दिया. He needs a cow shed, you are giving a latrine. Because you don't allow him to take his decision. And I am not talking about something which is very imaginary. You go to Nagaland today, suppose in a village there is a petroleum reserve found. Do you know, government of India with all its military might cannot explore it without the permission of that village head. And remember, that village head is not elected through any of your Panchayat Raj system. He is a tribal system. Through tribal system, he becomes the head of the village. Once he is head of the village, he is also the master of the territory of the village. He decides, good or bad. You had a system. You replaced it with something you brought from outside. Fair enough, that also has worked. I have no dispute about it. But are you ready to explore the other? Are you willing to at least think about it? Then you think about it, you will get models. We are ready to work on that.
But at the same time, you also quote Deen Dayal Upadhyaya to argue for a non-federal kind of a government, where you say that a unitary form of government, with of course, with the distribution of power, etc. So how do these two things sit together?
Oh yes, in this country, in any case, we don't call ourselves a federal country. There is no federal word in our constitution. We have a unitary government. In fact, there was a lot of debate over it also in Constituent Assembly. There were people who insisted that states should have equal powers as princely states. Those princely states which got, which joined the Indian Federation at that time, Indian Dominion at that time, all those powers should be again returned to states. At that time, Ambedkar, in his wisdom, decided that no, our system will be unitary with certain powers given to states, certain powers to be, both state and center enjoying. RSS school of thought has always insisted on state to be unitary, but state should be small. You need to be a unitary state, but you should be a small state. You should allow maximum number of functions to be delegated to the lowest units. That is including villages. You create institutions, units, separate units, but system should be unitary. That's what was one view that was upheld by, you are right, Deen Dayal ji and also Guruji Golwalkar. Because India is a very diverse country. So in this diverse country, to have that kind of a federal structure may not really suit us fully. So we are, Golwalkar or no Golwalkar, Indian Constitution doesn't give you any federal powers like the US Constitution gives. In US, states have powers to secede. 2 states at least have their constitutions even to this day, which give them power to secede at any time. So that kind of powers were not given in our Indian Constitution. It was largely unitary with certain limited powers given to states. And it's another matter. There is a lot of discussion that even those powers are shrinking.
Yeah. Since we have been alerted about the time, one last question which you also touched upon earlier, again quoting from Deen Dayal ji, you say that he bemoaned the fact that even 17 years after independence, India has progressed without a direction. And of course, I suppose those 17 years refer to Nehru's prime ministership. And you also said India, we are very good with giving ideas, philosophy. But don't you think that the Constitution itself is a kind of a framework to turn that philosophy into an actionable, guideline?
Oh, yes, India has a great constitution which has served our country very well for last 70 years. It has kept the country united. It has saved the country from many difficult situations. So the constitution is a very sound basis for our country to remain one, to remain united politically. Like today, no region in the country or no group in the country can claim to go out of this country. And we have seen some such powers were vested with certain states like Jammu and Kashmir, which had to be withdrawn because they were being misused. They were given probably out of certain historical reasons. They also outlived their utility, but they continued for political reasons. They needed to be withdrawn. And that power also Constitution gave. So that secessionist, separatist tendencies don't find roots in this country, in this nation. To that extent, the Constitution is a great document that has served us in all these years. Every Indian citizen should loyally abide by India's Constitution. There is no doubt about it. But Constitution is a document. You have a greatest document, but the holders of that constitution are bad, then there is no guarantee that such a good constitution also is going to, help the nation. You have seen periods in this country when using that very same constitution, dictatorship was imposed on the people. Remember emergency. Emergency did not come by violating constitution. Using constitution it came. Certain provisions, emergency powers. Using constitutional powers, you can, remove governments in states. Constitution is a document. And remember, we are a democracy where majority, we follow that European model, so majority decides what is right or what is not right. And you know how majorities are created in this country. That also need not be, we all know about it. So that's why in any democracy, there are elected majorities, but unelected institutions like judiciary. Like, Vigilance Commission. Chaudharyji is here. These are not elected bodies. These are unelected bodies. These unelected bodies are the balancing institutions in a majoritarian democracy. But the problem comes when these bodies fail to deliver independently. Using same democratic model, you can rob the power of those institutions. You can make them lame duck. So, merely because you have a constitution, you are safe. That is also not going to be the correct thinking. You need right people to hold that constitution up. Joseph Story, who can be called as Nani Palkiwala of America, one of the greatest jurists of America, used to say that America has greatest constitutions in the world, one of the greatest constitutions in the world. But the bearers of this constitution, if they turn out to be bad, all good people think that politics is bad, they stay away from politics, scoundrels become rulers, and constitution is in their hands. This greatest constitution is also going to not help the people of America. So what we need is good people, good men with values, men with political values. So many political values Deen Dayal talks about in his integral humanism. He says democracy can only succeed if you have moral men at the helm. What Plato talked about 2,500 years ago, Deen Dayal also talks, Gandhiji also talks about it. So constitution is important, but the holders of constitution, they are even more important for any nation.
I think that's a very important cautionary note for everybody to end this conversation with. Thank you, Ram Madhavji. Pleasure speaking with you always.
Thank you.
Thank you.